Hi. So I'm Selam. So I thought this picture could be clearer, maybe the lights, yeah. So I thought this picture would help me also explain what I do, because sometimes spending a lot of time on the negotiations is challenging, but it also has its benefits. So especially on how words are framed, right? So when how Nate became the thing. So this sometimes from the negotiation rooms, it ends up in a huddle where you're actually testing words that end up going to a decision. So sometimes that's a challenge, but that's also one of the reasons why I wanted to join Oxford, to have that academic insight, the theory, and to bring that science to the practice that I enjoy working on. So on the left at that time was the Grenada minister. Now he is the ES of the UNFCCC. So this was the one of the longest run over COPs, COP25, where we're trying to save the COP with a proposal that could advance the rulemaking under the Paris Agreement. So this was COP25. But COP25, some do criticize it, saying that LACE has been achieved, but there was some achievements on rule development, and in particular to net zero. Three things come to my mind. The first is some government people might not know about it, but most policymakers that are on top do recognize that word. And there are guidance that are part of the climate regime process. So international law has provided a clarity around, a general guidance around what net zero means. So the first anchoring was 10 years ago when we adopted the Paris Agreement. So it talks about long-term mitigation trajectories. So countries need to think about long-term mitigation trajectories. They need to think about reaching the limits, the global peaking, as soon as possible for some, and taking into account it would take longer for developing countries. Then it also spoke about the elements that we just discussed, rapid reductions and achieving the balance between removals and sinks. So that guidance of what net zero means was embedded in the treaty itself. But then there were a few things that were not clear, right? So this is also something that I'm thinking about, and something we also need to think about is, okay, that general guidance is there, but how do we actually make it ambitious? How do we make it credible? And how do we aggregate it, right? So are we trying to achieve something? So the first is on the scope, and the scope it covers. The second is how do we address residual emissions? The removal quality, as we've been discussing this morning, and then the accounting choices. So this is something that countries have continued to think about and need to think about, and a newer lens that I would present a bit later. So the second point from the Paris Agreement, we evolved. Yes, countries said we need to submit our long-term emission reduction strategies, and there was further guidance. So countries would now know that we need to submit, countries need to submit their long-term strategies. So that's the process or the vehicle of how we get to net zero. So there is a requirement from international law where countries are requested to submit long-term strategies. And these long-term strategies are the strategies where countries communicate how they understand net zero, how they would achieve net zero, and then the sectors they would define it. So that process is there, and around 80 countries have submitted long-term strategies. So I would argue that we need to keep with the net zero term, but really try to clarify what could be done, including defining the parameters to make it better. And the second important discussion following from Jessica's point was, okay, we countries develop long-term strategies, but then how does that reflect the different contexts of countries, different realities of countries? So that's the actual term net zero came in the decision under the UNFCCC process at COP28. So it was the COP presidency at that time introduced long-term strategies should achieve net zero. At that point, the African group proposed also one of the areas I work on is supporting the negotiations under the UNFCCC space, is really to say, okay, how do we understand net zero strategies? And then that was the proposal led towards just transitions to net zero emission. So whenever you type transitions now, it would be auto-corrected, but that's part of a decision. So there is no singular transition to net zero. So there are multiple transitions. So that further guidance of who defines transition was also to some extent reflected for the first time at COP26. So we got that term, net zero, embedded in our climate regime, and then there is plurality of the transitions embedded in decisions. So this is expected that this would guide countries in communication of their long-term strategies or net zero strategies. And as per that, for example, India has submitted 2070 to be the year where they would reach that net zero, while many others have said 2050. But that didn't really end there. It was important, and this bringing me back to the work with Oxford Net Zero, is really to think about how do we understand transitions? How do we understand transitions, especially from developing countries' perspective, where priorities are sustainable development, real realities of countries are eradicating poverty? How do we understand that? So, and interestingly, the COP after COP26 was COP27. It was an African COP. So working with the Egyptian presidency, what we proposed was we need to think about transition pathways to net zero. So now the discussion has been, we see net zero transitions from emission reduction perspective, but there has to be more to it. So transition needs to be defined. Of course, the first priority should be emission reduction, but the second could be how do we invest on resilience and what's the contribution of that to net zero? And the third would be the transitioning of our financial sectors. How do we transition financial sectors to support low emission projects, but while taking into account that there could be sustainable development needs? So that led to the discussion around establishing the work program on just transition pathways. So this is another interesting picture where, of course, after the official preliminary, some texts are being tested, and we ended up establishing just transition pathways. So that pathway is now framed not only around emission, but it's around temperature goal, the emission reduction, sustainable development, addressing poverty eradication. And then it spans across energy, socioeconomic, workforce, of course, and then bringing social protection, I think has been said earlier, so it needs to look into that account as well. So finally, so of course I said countries, at least governments, need to understand what net zero means, because they have been having this decision for the last 10 years. They have been given this guidance. They know the modality of how they need to communicate their net zero, but what is missing is the question. What's missing is a framework, a common framework that could actually help us in raising ambition, credibility, aggregated so that we know where we're going with this. But there are a few challenges, right? The first is the geopolitical fragmentation. We are in a geopolitical time where multilateralism is being questioned, and countries are questioning even the truth of climate change itself. So how do we address that is the first question. The second is net zero is beyond emissions. I want to make that point. Maybe a point that I want to leave with is it's beyond emissions. It's really now coming into other sectors where net zero is also a component of value chain definition. So how net zero is reached would depend on our industrial policy, trade policy, and so on. The third is the different competing clubs, or we have heard the middle powers narrative now, where countries of a few with common principles would need to do something to address that. So the final proposal is we need to change how we see the question of net zero. And the proposal is we need to see it through a lens of cooperation. And that cooperation needs to go beyond the UNFCCC. So it's not only the climate change that would answer this question, but it's beyond the UNFCCC where we need to bring the trade element, recognize development priorities of countries, not only developing countries, but developed countries' economic security is something that we need to ensure, and we need to see through that lens, including a very recent example is the EU-India trade deal, where EU waived the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment, for a return to the 500 million finance provision. So India would now work around CBAM, the border adjustments, because they have now this finance provision given. So it's now beyond the climate discussion. So that will be something what I will be thinking about next. So really to see net zero beyond emissions, beyond the UNFCCC space, and really linking it to trade, industrial policy, and sustainable development. Thank you.